Sholay is the most famous movie I have reviewed on this channel. It captivated generations and revolutionized an industry. If you haven't heard of this movie, then you probably are not from India. A number of years ago, I was very interested in Indian cinema, both Bollywood films and non-Hindi films, mainly Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, things like that. I watched a huge variety of Indian movies, and I had only one rule, which was not to watch anything from before the year 2000. There was one exception, which was Dil Se, but otherwise, I stayed away from older things, like The Plague. This rule was formed from a couple of bad experiences. One was with Anda's Apna Apna, which I couldn't finish, thought was horrible. Another big one was with the film Sholay, which I only watched about 20 minutes of before giving up. Now, 5 or 6 years later, I've come back to see if my younger self was lacking perspective, or if Sholay really is one big case of you had to be there. First of all, what is this movie? Well, it's a Western, essentially. Very heavily influenced by spaghetti Westerns, the films of Sergio Leone. The music, for instance, sounds an awful lot like Ennio Morricone's music. The style is a lot like what you would see in these movies. A lot of sharp cuts, jumping from a character describing something, we go straight to seeing it happen. There are a lot of individual scenes, specific scenes and plot lines that seem that they were lifted from somewhere else. Spaghetti Westerns, classic American Westerns. But that shouldn't entirely discount some of the craftsmanship that goes into this movie. It is relatively well shot. At the same time, it looks pretty old. Even the new 3D version of this film looks pretty old. Of course, the movie is old, but compared to an American film from 1975, or at least some American films from 1975, this one looks a lot older, a lot grainier. There might be something to unpack there, but for now, let's just leave it as a comment on the style. This movie also has a bit of samurai influence. You might recognize some elements of the plot from early Japanese films. Two men protecting a helpless village from a tyrannical bandit. The villagers in the background not knowing what to do. The village is in some ways a cinematic construct. Obviously, villages are real things, but the way this one is shown, the way the villagers come in and out of the story, it seems to be quite a bit inspired by some early Japanese films in some ways. The thing that those movies have in common is the feudal system, by the way. And this film in some ways is commenting on the feudal system, I guess. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. This is also a masala film. Some would say that Sholay actually defined what a masala film is, that it invented it to some extent. A masala film is a film that has something for everyone, a movie that the whole family can go to. This movie has a lot of action. It also has extensive comedic sequences. It's got two big romantic subplots that it spends a lot of time on. At the same time, it has moral moments, moments of moral reckoning, moments where the villagers argue about what's right. It also has song and dance. This is a long movie, by the way. No surprise. I watched the director's cut, which is 3 hours and 24 minutes, I think. Anything you could possibly want to see in a movie, you can see in this movie. And this really is the prototype for most major Bollywood films in the years since. Hollywood has also had films, though, with this kind of focus. You might notice, for instance, when you watch Vertigo or Rear Window, there's moments of comedic relief, things you might not exactly expect to find in a mystery or a thriller. And I think the idea was mostly to broaden the audience. This was a time, the 50s, when there was only one rating for films, approved. And so you would maybe expect families, or at least couples, to go to the theater together. The U.S. also had big roadshow pictures in the 50s and 60s designed to outshine television. Masala films and roadshow films are in some ways, they have a lot in common, both in their actual content, but also in some of the constraints about their distribution. There's an Indian movie called Swades, where there's a scene with some people watching a movie in the village, all sort of crowded around a big projector. And this maybe hints at what kind of a spectacle a film could be. It's hard to overstate the influence of Sholay. This is a movie that basically everyone from a certain generation will have seen. It's a movie that spawned sayings, coined phrases that became commonplace. I think you get the idea. It's a big deal, okay? I don't have the same sentimental connection to this film that a lot of people do. And I don't have a deep intuition for the cultural importance of the movie. I can tell you about it, but I don't have an intuition for it. Depending on your perspective, that might make this review useless or very useful. It could be that I'm clueless or perhaps objective. I think it's probably somewhere in between. It's always possible that something is lost in translation in these movies, right? But keep in mind that I have seen quite a few Indian movies. I'm not totally clueless about the country and the cinema, and also I can at least compare this movie against some of the other ones, because presumably those movies have also lost something in translation. Presumably other international films I've covered on this channel have. So I think it's not too much to ask to try and figure out, is this movie actually any good? Most of this time, Sholay, well, not most of the time, but from time to time, many times, Sholay has found itself at the top of some ranking, some list of the greatest Indian movies. Of course, the greatest film can mean a lot of different things. Maybe it's thinking in terms of impact. Interestingly, a lot of the lists that put Sholay at the top seem to come from the early 2000s, late 90s, a time just before a lot of the movies that might now hold that spot had come out. Setting aside influence, do I think this is the best Indian movie now? Definitely not. And going a step further, I can tell you that you probably will not like Sholay. My original reaction, turning it off after 20 minutes, is pretty reasonable. But that definitely isn't the whole story, and I do have good things to say about this movie. I also have bad things to say about this movie. There are many parts that are extremely goofy. Of course, it's supposed to be a comedy to some extent, so you would expect some goofy moments. But the comedic moments in this film are really so over the top that they might seem more at home in a silent film. There's a long sequence in a prison, for instance, towards the beginning of the movie that is basically a budget version of Hogan's Heroes. I think the movie would have been better without this, which is honestly true for a lot of the pieces of the movie besides the main storyline. Like I said, this is a masala film with lots of different stuff in it, but that might not end up being a good thing because a lot of the stuff is pretty weak. This prison scene, really, really weak. I guess it must have seemed amusing at the time, I guess, but extremely weak. It's worth noting that Sergio Leone's westerns are also very episodic. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly actually has its own prison sequence. Leone tends to sort of whisk his characters off at the last moment from one adventure to another. Just when you think things are coming to a close, things go off in a totally different direction. This is kind of a hallmark of his narrative style in some ways, and I think it's great in those movies. And occasionally, Sholay almost pulls it off. It kind of has the buddy comedy thing going a little bit. It kind of pulls off the adventure thing a little bit. But like I said, a lot of the individual episodes are just too weak. Sholay is also very dated in many different ways. It's a lot more dated than some other movies from 1975. I don't know if it's more dated than other Indian movies from 1975. Who knows? Seemingly more dated to me, at least. Like I mentioned earlier, it looks kind of bad. Like I mentioned, it's kind of goofy, not always in a good way. It's also quite regressive in a number of ways, like when it comes to women's roles. One of the main romantic interests in this film is a woman named Basanti. Basanti is a Tonga driver. It's like a horse and buggy or a rickshaw, like a taxi, essentially. Uber, but with a horse. Basanti is given a comedic introduction where she says she won't talk too much during the trip. She's taking the two main characters, Jai and Viru, to the village of Ramgarh. She says she won't talk too much, but she ends up never stopping. She talks the entire time in a somewhat goofy manner, I guess. This is playing on some very common stereotypes about women, and maybe in 1975 it would have seemed amusing. I think a lot of people in my generation would be skeptical, at least, of this. Is this political correctness gone mad? I don't think so. These are not hugely hilarious jokes to begin with, hugely innovative comedy at any point. Like I said, very dated. Now, I actually think that Basanti is a fairly strong character in some ways, along with most of the other characters in the film, but she's one that is firmly rooted in the past and that doesn't really fly today. Another problem with Sholay is that it's incredibly predictable. Like I said, a lot of its moments feel like replays of other films, and this might explain why you usually feel like you know what's going to happen. I don't think there was a single twist in this film that surprised me, and there are a couple things that seemingly are supposed to be twists, but they're pretty darn obvious. This movie kind of jumps around a lot. It goes back in time and you tell stories. And there's a number of times where, for instance, the Thakur is about to tell a story. He says, oh, well, I'll tell you how I met so-and-so, or I'll tell you how this happened. I don't want to spoil anything here. Despite saying it's completely predictable, I figure I still shouldn't spoil it. And even while he's introducing the story that you're about to flash back to, you usually already know how it's going to end. And yet you're still going to go through 15 minutes of seeing the story, and then it ends exactly how you expect it to end. And then you get back. Like I said, not a single twist in the movie that really surprised me. And that's probably not exactly how it was intended. Despite all these complaints, though, I actually don't think that Sholay is bad. Like I mentioned earlier, the characters are pretty strong. They're over the top. They're dated. But there's still a lot of charisma there. Jai and Viru have a compelling relationship with each other. Like I said, they kind of pull off the buddy comedy pretty well in this movie. The romantic subplots are pretty lame, but Basanti has some resolve. She doesn't quite have depth exactly, but there is something compelling about her. There is some nuance. She has some resolve. Gabbar Singh and the Thakur are both pretty one-dimensional, but they're dynamic enough to keep the story going, to keep the drama building. The central storyline of the movie, I think, is actually pretty good. Yes, it is derivative. Yes, it misses some opportunities to add real complexity. But still, it's relatively compelling. Now, unfortunately, it takes well over an hour for us to really get to the compelling parts of the movie, for us to really get to the crux of the main story, to see what it's all about. My number one piece of advice with Sholay is to be patient, because the beginning is definitely not the best part. Like I said, you got to sit through a really strange, comedic prison scene. If you stick around, I think you actually can get into the movie, though. Even if that goes for everybody. I think anybody watching this, if you stick around, you give it a chance, I think you can get into the movie to some extent. Sholay does also have some interesting thematic material. There are things to think about. This is definitely not one of the most thought-provoking movies that I've covered, but it has some interesting aspects. There's some things about fate. For instance, some questions of luck. We see a lot of coin flips, a lot of Russian roulette in this film. In some ways, there's a number of times where we're kind of flipping a coin to see if the story is going to happen or not. For instance, in the very beginning, Jai and Viewer are invited sort of on an adventure, and they're skeptical about doing it, so they flip a coin. Well, what if the coin landed tails? Would the movie just not exist? Would it just be them wandering around doing nothing? There's a number of places where there's kind of a choice, but the narrative has rigged the result in some ways. The narrative has rigged the coin toss in some ways. We know that it's going to be heads, because otherwise there would be no movie. So it's kind of an interesting look at fate in some ways. We see this a number of times. There's a Russian roulette scene where the results that probability would dictate are not at all the results that you see. Luck has been tampered with a lot in this movie. Things you can make out of this. If I knew more about Indian culture, I might try to make some conclusion about maybe national feeling about luck, or the religious feelings about luck, how it might relate to Hinduism. But honestly, I have no idea. Luck is in the foreground of this movie, without a doubt. There's another thing that's not too different here. There's a pretty stark contrast between the stock characters and the heroes in this movie. Like I said, there's a lot of villagers in this movie who are kind of in the background. I actually think that they do this pretty well. They do a pretty good job of having some characters who are only in the movie for a little bit, like one of the conniving friends of Jai and Viru at the beginning. Characters that are maybe just there for a little bit of a comedic appearance. I actually think most of them come off relatively well. They're decent characters. Like I said, dated, goofy, but there's some charisma there. They're decent characters. They work. They're in the background, though. Then we have the heroes who are sort of embodied, right? Jai and Viru, who, in some ways, another downfall of this movie is that Jai and Viru are just incredibly powerful, despite seeming like completely normal people, being these pals who seem not very extraordinary. They kind of lavish in their ordinariness. They're slobs at times. They're lazy at times. Well, they also are incredibly good shots, incredibly good marksmen, incredibly brave, right? So, slight downfall of the movie. And also these superpowers are in some ways used to wrap up the ending more quickly than it should have. It's kind of a classic case of the problem in a film being really amped up, seeming like there's an impenetrable issue, unbreakable wall, immovable object. And then when it comes time for the movie to end, when you start getting towards the end, suddenly the characters just find the strength from seemingly nowhere to topple the obstacles relatively quickly. This is a common problem in a lot of movies, and this film is no different. But, like I said, there is an interesting contrast here between these kind of stock characters and the heroes. This is a common narrative device, obviously, to have some main characters and some not main characters. Most stories are like this. But it's also an interesting sort of idea, this embodiment. Most movies are about main characters. Sure, that's a narrative device, but it also says something about the cinematic inclination towards feeling like a main character. This is a saying that goes around a little bit more these days. Like, I feel like a main character when I'm, driving on the highway at night with the windows rolled down and playing this song. I feel like the main character of the world. What's that feeling like, and how has cinema constructed that? It's a pretty interesting question, and here we have another aspect of it because we have a cultural formulation of it, right? How has Indian culture, particularly the feudal culture, how has that kind of constructed this idea of embodiment? Films are also an invitation, usually, for people to participate in a certain type of lifestyle, to take on a certain sort of character, right? This film invites us into maybe being a bit more like Giant Viru in some ways. Why does it do that, and how does that fit with the India of 1975? Interesting questions. One thing you might wonder about, for instance, is if there's any influence of the caste system in India, and if that has any connection to the stock characters and the heroes. Hard to know. I don't want to reach for something because I don't know much. But something to think about. There might be more to it than just a simple narrative device. This is a nationalist film, not in terms of politics, but in terms of morals. Like I said, Basanti is a fairly regressive character. She is charismatic, though. I think people would like her. I think women watching the movie in 1975 would have actually maybe identified with Basanti to some extent, would have liked the character, I guess, even if it seems pretty regressive now, at least to me. It's an interesting portrait of what gender should look like in this feudal system. In some ways, it's very simplistic. Basanti's not without resolve. There's an interesting scene where she has to participate in the fight against Gabbar Singh. That's the bad guy, by the way. She has to take up arms to some extent, except the woman isn't going to actually fight. She's not going to use violence. The plot's sort of rigged in a way that it turns out the way that she has to combat him is by dancing. At one point, she has to dance over broken glass. There is toughness, resolve to this. Interesting. There's also some interesting things about the rule of law. Here, Giant Viru are themselves bandits. They start out as bad guys. They're recruited because there's a special mission that only they can do because they are extremely brave. Their view on law, the rule of law, the value of a simple feudal lifestyle changes dramatically over the film. And one of the didactic thrusts of the movie is redoubling the value of the rule of law and the feudal lifestyle. Not too surprising. Like I said, nationalist film, if not politically, but in terms of morals. Interesting religious moments in this movie from time to time. Seems like we're poking fun at religion in a few places. That might not be totally what you would expect, but I think it is somewhat common in Indian cinema. The last thing to mention briefly, there's an interesting scene where there's a troupe of gypsies that is involved. And I don't know exactly if gypsies, that's the English translation of whatever was said there, so I don't know what it's actually referring to. Interesting portrait of the other. I wish I knew a little bit more about the context there to understand what that was. This is really our only portrait of people who are outside of, well, we have kind of the feudal system, the villagers. Then we have Giant Viru, who kind of exist outside of that and are brought in as these hired hands. Then there's Gabbar Singh, who's the bandit, who's outside of that. Then there's the gypsy, who is outside of that. It's interesting to think about all these different parties and how they're escaping the system to some extent. Some of them are bad guys. Some of them might eventually be enamored by the feudal system and adopt it. While the gypsies, it's hard to know. They just kind of drift outside of it. Interesting. Like I said, I'd have to know more to say much more than that. So those are some of the themes. And like I said, this is not some sort of art house puzzle film or anything. But there are definitely some partly historical, partly sort of cultural elements to this movie that are interesting and that stick out. In the film, you don't have to look too closely to see some of these themes jumping out at you. Overall, is it a great movie? No. The main thing you will think if you watch this movie today is that it's old and dated and goofy over the top, almost certainly. But like I said, if you're patient, I actually think you can get into Sholay, and I actually think it has some things going for it. Would I recommend it to people? No, not really. But was I right to turn it off 6 years ago or whenever when I first watched it to storm out 20 minutes into? No. There's a lot of interesting stuff you can get from this movie if you give it some time. You can get into it. You can learn some things. And at the very least, get an understanding of an extremely important film in cinema history. So that's Sholay. Hey, look, if you love this movie, if there's some huge context you think I'm missing, if there's something I really don't get, please roast me in the comments. I'd love to know what I've left out. I'd love to know what are the things. I'd also love to know just some of the sayings, if you happen to know, some of the sayings that came from this movie. A man is not a coin or something. I've got all the English translations. I don't know what the big memes from this film were. I'd be very interested. But that's it for now, and that is Sholay.